Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Jojo. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in Josh's lab. Um, I want to start by thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about some pretty early stage work. Okay, so there are three main goals that I hope to accomplish in this talk. The first is I want to convince you that it's worth studying cooperation and institutions in tandem. Two, if you buy that, then I want to argue that you have to study them when the institutions are in competition with each other. And three, if you buy that, then I'll propose a model that hopefully does so. Okay. Okay, so imagine you're a nurse finishing a long 12-hour shift and you're very tired. You're required to perform a handover process with the next nurse starting their shift. So your decision now to be cursory in your handover or to be very thorough, even volunteering some of your extra time, can have a very big impact. Being extra diligent, being cooperative, gives a benefit to this next nurse's performance, not to mention a benefit to the patient and to the hospital's effectiveness, but all at the cost of potentially your personal time, which the hospital potentially can't record due to overtime rules. So other examples of institutions caring about cooperation include peer code reviews at tech companies, which might be pretty antiquated now, actually, and volunteering at local gardens or shopping at small businesses in local communities. So these, oh, it's a little bit glitchy. Ask for a little. Yeah, so in the meantime, I guess you can notice that there's supposed to be something here that says these images are generated by Gemini. So sorry, Fung and Errol. I know that there are some people out there who are still actually drawing cartoons, so the fact that I am generating the cartoons does not bode well. So I'm just going to continue even though there's a little bit of glitching going on. So hopefully that won't be too much of a distraction. Okay, so if institutions are better off when the individuals cooperate, it stands to reason that they would try to promote cooperative behavior, right? So to gain some intuition about what an institution can potentially do, the extent that an institution should reward cooperative behavior is naturally upper bounded by the sum total production that cooperators bring to the institution. So now the institution has a few choices to incentivize cooperative behavior. It can redistribute some or all of that production back to cooperators, boosting their fitness effectively. Or if the institution is selfish in some sense, it could keep that production for itself, or it could spread it more evenly, sort of as a public good if the institution has no information about who's cooperating and who isn't. So this kind of hints at that in many cases, it's actually hard to track cooperative behavior practice. Um, Tracking who's cooperating is naturally a prerequisite to rewarding the cooperators. So in the hospital example from earlier, um, the hospital might not allow the logging of the voluntary extra handover process because there might be some overtime rules. How would a city government track if Joe in a small town is a friendly face in the garden or shops at small businesses or uses Amazon? It can be hard to tell. Okay, so there are some instances, though, so hopefully this will motivate that first question I was talking about. There are some instances where institutions are able to track cooperative behavior and reward individuals for it, and we see this. So if Joe is more than just neighborly, and he actually donates part of his salary to charity, then the government gives him a tax deduction. So this can be thought of as the government paying some of the tax back to Joe. In other words, the government has redistributed some of the funds it's amassed via taxation to reward Joe's cooperative behavior. So with this example in mind, we're going to start by describing and building on work from the lab a few years ago from Okabe and Plotkin that models a single institution's tax and redistribution policy and how that affects cooperative behavior. And then we're gonna, as I hinted at earlier in sort of the title of the talk, we are gonna then propose an extension that allows for competition between institutions. Okay, so I think it's only sort of this part of the screen that's glitching out. I think everything else is okay. Okay. So let's take a step back and talk about the single institution model before we put the institutions in competition with each other. Consider a large, well-mixed population of individuals along with an institution. The individuals play a pairwise donation game with cooperators incurring a cost C to give a benefit B greater than C. Okay, so if we stop right there and the institution actually has no influence at all, there's no tax, there's nothing, then we can see up here that this is the standard payoffs for the donation game in a well-mixed population, and then we can run that using replicator dynamics, but that's not interesting. So, or it is interesting, but not what this talk is about. To this, we add a baseline level of production D, which shows up over here. Okay, and then we also begin building what the institution can do. Okay, so first of all, D can be thought of as like a salary that an individual can dip into in order to cooperate. Okay, so an institution taxes all individuals at a rate T. And we also assume that this taxation is not necessarily fully efficient. So there's an efficiency rate delta. And then there's a withholding rate alpha. So another way to think of alpha is it's 1 minus the redistribution rate. So the institution is taxing all individuals at a rate T. There's an inefficiency factor delta, and then a portion of that 1 minus alpha is given back to the cooperators. Okay, so it's certainly not necessarily the case that an institution directly cares about the well-being of its members, okay? For example, if the institution we're talking about is a company, they might care about profits, and if the institution is a utopian city government, then maybe they actually care about the well-being of the citizens. So we study two classes of institutions I dub pro-social and selfish. So a pro-social institution is defined by utility function of the total utility, the total fitness of the population. And a selfish institution is characterized by the total tax revenue it keeps for itself. So I want to just remind you that we're still in the single institution case. I'm just showing a side-by-side here of two different types of institutions. So the first thing I want to talk about is that the proportion, so you've noticed that I've talked about how cooperators evolve in the system, but I actually haven't talked about how an institution evolves its tax policies. So I'm going to do that now. So the tax policies evolve at a relative rate epsilon using gradient descent. One of the main results from Okabe and Plotkin is that if the institution just tries to optimize on this instantaneous utility, they actually fail to reach good tax policies. So for example, if a selfish institution only cares about their current utility, we can call this a myopic selfish institution. It may be too busy withholding tax revenue now to realize that if it promoted cooperation, there would be more production to then tax later. So the displayed results here, hence the little asterisk, are for reasonably forward-looking institutions that are able to discover high-quality tax policies. And we see that this leads to high levels of cooperation in both the selfish and pro-social institution. So I want to now talk about some interesting results from the single institution case, and we're going to keep those in our back pocket to compare to the multi-institution case in the future. So as I mentioned, both of these institutions are reasonably forward-looking, and they actually do promote cooperation. And in the absence of an institution, we know that a well-mixed population would fixate defectors. So there is at least something good going on. But notice that, while the selfish institution is able to maintain high levels of cooperation, the cooperators are actually not doing so good, especially as compared to in the pro-social case. So, um, yes. So basically, the cooperators in the selfish institutions are doing just good enough to promote some level of cooperation so the institution can then tax them almost maximally. Okay. So some other results that are worth talking about here is that a pro-social's withholding rate, alpha, always tends to 0 monotonically, and a selfish institution's tax rate, T, tends to 1 monotonically. So to build some intuition about this, a sanity check, if you will, so a pro-social institution has nothing to gain by withholding any tax for itself, so of course it would send it to 0. And a selfish institution has nothing to gain by leaving defectors with any income, so it sends the tax rate to 1. So we're going to ask a few questions about this. In particular, will these results hold when we introduce competition between institutions? So here's a summary of the results. Institutions, even selfish ones, promote cooperation. Cooperators in selfish institutions are worse off than in a pro-social one. This kind of, piques our intuition here. And then pro-social institutions never withhold, and selfish institutions tax maximally. So in summary, I'm going to ask, and we're going to be looking for in the next few slides, will these results hold in particular? Will a selfish institution always be maximally taxing? And is it always true that cooperators are worse off in a selfish institution? So I'm talking about competition this, competition that, but I actually haven't defined competition. And so before I define competition, I'm going to try to motivate that it's worth talking about. So you learn in high school economics class that monopolies are bad because once a company owns a sufficient portion of the market share for a product, they can modulate the prices of their good however they want. So this is true of employees' salaries as well. If there's no other company that works on Joe's specialty, then Joe is tied to working for that company, and then so the company has full power to modulate his salary. In other words, Joe has no leverage. So we give sort of power to the people, so to speak, and we give Joe some leverage. So we're going to define competition between two institutions by giving individuals the power to move between institutions. So right now, and this is an early stage framework. Right now, institutions don't have an immigration policy. They can't restrict Joe if he wants to move from one institution to another. This can be potentially added later on. So before in the single institution case, from Joe's perspective, he's deciding between two strategies, to cooperate or defect, right? But now in the multi-institution case, let's say there are I institutions, Joe actually has two I strategies to pick from. He can choose his cooperative strategy, C or D, and he can also choose where to reside while performing said cooperative strategy. Okay, so I'm gonna state that Joe's headspace is always in one of exactly two modes. He's always in the framework of I'm definitely wanting to stay part of the time, and the other part of the time he's considering leaving. Okay, so in particular, in definitely stay, Joe only swaps his cooperative strategy, not his institution, and in the considering go mode, he is considering leaving or staying and performing any cooperative strategy in any institution. So one thing to note here is that if we fixed everyone in the population to be in a certain mode, then we could model the system using replicator dynamics. So if we fix everyone and consider go, then it would be replicator dynamics with 2I strategies. Okay, so this is a lot on one page, and I'm not going to talk much about it, but you'll notice that these are the same expressions for payoffs except with subscripts now. corresponding to the institution. Another thing to notice now is that the population within each institution is not fixed. That's PI. Before this was fixed because there's only one institution and you could only change your strategy within it. But now you can leave institutions. Okay, so going back to modes here. So if kappa is the relative rate of Joe or any individual being in the considering go regime of his headspace, if we send kappa to 0, then this sort of recovers exactly what we had before. Everyone is just staying in their current institution. They don't want to leave. So it recovers a single institution model. Different institutions all in a vacuum. Now, if kappa is non-zero, if kappa is, to build intuition, if kappa is very high relative to 1, then Joe and all individuals have absolutely no tie to their current institution. So it's as if they're free to move. It's sort of as if there are no institutions to begin with. So kappa modulates the relative rate that Joe or any individual is in the mindset of considering leaving. Okay, so I want to end with some very preliminary results. As I said, this is a pretty new model. Before that, I want to remind you of some questions that we had earlier. So will a selfish institution always tax maximally? No. So here's an example. These are two selfish institutions in competition with each other according to the previous model. I've started them at all the same parameters. I've only set the initial conditions of the tax policy different so that we can differentiate between the blue and red lines. Okay, so a couple things to notice here is that the institutions are trying to, these are selfish institutions again, and our intuition from the single institution case is that they want to tax maximally, right? So they try to tax maximally at first. So even the institution that starts at a pretty strict tax rate tries to go up initially. And the one that starts at a very low tax rate, well, these institutions are defining their utility based on how much revenue they're bringing in. So this guy has to increase his tax rate. But after a certain point, even the institution that starts at a high tax rate realizes that it simply can't compete. Individuals are leaving their institution for the more forgiving one. And then they settle on an intermediate equilibrium value. Okay, so next question. Will pro-social institutions always be better for cooperators than selfish ones? Also no. So here we've pitted a pro-social institution versus an efficient selfish institution. So going back a few slides earlier, we're talking about how delta is the efficiency parameter of an institution. It is reasonable, you could argue, that selfish institutions could be more efficient. For example, if you are at a nonprofit, before you distribute your salaries, you have to read through all of the laws of what you can do as a charity or a nonprofit. And selfish and for-profit companies maybe don't have to do that as much, especially if they don't have shareholders to answer to. Okay, so let's talk about these results a little bit. So as you'll notice, surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly for people who have really good intuition, that the pro-social institution is not able to actually maintain cooperation at any kind of reasonable level. So from the perspective of an individual who may not know whether the institution that they're in is it a nice institution or is it a selfish one, to Joe, Joe living in a selfish institution feels like he's in the better one. His fitness is better and he's able to be a cooperator. And in the pro-social institution, it's only able to survive by encouraging immigration of defectors, which I think is interesting. So yeah, so this talk is mostly about answering those or discussing those 3 points from earlier. It's worth studying cooperation through the lens of institutions. If you buy that, then we've got to put the institutions in competition with each other, and then hopefully putting forth a model that is rich enough to study going forward. Thanks.
Okay, we have a moment to ask Jojo any questions, and then we'll actually break, and I'll ask the speakers to assemble near chalkboards out in this lovely space and take questions informally over coffee. But are there any quick questions for Jojo before we break?
Yeah, thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have thoughts on if you could have cooperators bargaining, for example, through a union. So the cooperators have some form of power, basically, with respect to the institution.
Bargaining, as in, can you describe that?
Like maybe they could, they could refuse to work or something like that
Ah,
if the taxation rate exceeds.
that's very so a different mode where they're not wanting to leave, but they're willing to lean on the institutional. I think that's a good idea. I haven't thought about that.
Like, can institutions choose to transition to the other, to mimic the other institution if they realize like the other institution do better?
Right now, we haven't put that in. So the mimicking that might occur is that a selfish institution these institutions who have a fixed utility function might try to mimic the tax policies so as to get people over. But we don't have it right now where they can actually change their utility function. Yeah.
Does this model allow for a competition among institutions where some of them die out and maybe one of them survives and takes over?
Yeah, so what I didn't show is the vast amount of situations where this actually occurs. So I think that the two cases that I did show are that sort of both of these institutions are able to survive together. If, for example, you put a pro-social institution against a selfish one that had the same level of efficiency, the pro-social institution would beat out the selfish one. So actually, in most cases, I would say that you can't have multiple institutions surviving together.